You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host from New York City, Ankit Panda.
And this is Prashant Paramaswaran from Washington, D.C.
Happy New Year to you, Prashant. Good to be back with you.
Yeah, same to you.
Yeah, so we're definitely kicking off 2020 with no shortage of things to talk about on the Asia Geopolitics podcast. We already just taped an episode this week with the Diplomats editor-in-chief Shannon Tiezi on the upcoming elections in Taiwan. I very much recommend listeners go check that out. That's going to be a very important election to kick off a year that's going to contain certainly no shortage of interesting elections in Asia and elsewhere. But the big story, and this is really kind of on the frontier of the region that we at the Diplomat consider to be the Asia Pacific, is the remarkable U.S. Drone strike to assassinate General Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian major general who leads the Quds Force, sort of Iran's equivalent of Central Command, so to speak, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' expeditionary arm that carries out manages a range of proxy operations and international operations in the Middle East. This has certainly been the biggest news story this week. Pretty much everywhere has been talking about the implications of this strike, what various countries are doing in response. But I thought, Prashant, it'd be a good way to start off this episode is maybe to just go over a quick timeline of what exactly happened with the strike on Soleimani. Because I think, if you've been reading the news, I'm sure everybody's heard about what happened, but it's important to know, I think, how we got here. And I think the place to maybe start is around December 27th, 2019 or so, a few days before New Year's. So, of course, we had an attack by an Iran-aligned proxy group, Kataib Hezbollah, one of the most aligned Shiite militias in Iraq, with the Iranian government that struck a military base near Kirkuk in Iraq, killing an American contractor. And also several Americans and Iraqis were wounded in the attack. And the Trump administration, of course, has been, positioning itself to deal with a varying range of Iranian provocations over the last year. Really, all of this goes back to the May 2018 decision by the administration to withdraw from the JCPOA, the 2015 Iran nuclear agreement. Iran has been lashing out in a number of ways for a variety of reasons in the Middle East. I won't go too much into the geopolitics of the Middle East, obviously, since, we don't really do that on this podcast. But broadly speaking, we've seen a number of Iranian actions, including attacks on tankers, the remarkable attacks earlier last fall on Saudi oil facilities by Iran as well. So on the 29th, then, the Trump administration responds to that attack by authorizing airstrikes against Kataib Hezbollah. That airstrike is seen widely as, I think, disproportionate, kills far more members of the militia than were killed in the original strike on the base, which just killed one American contractor, of course. And that leads to members of the militia, supporters of Kataib Hezbollah, storming the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. And that happens around New Year's Eve. And, of course, that's a very tense moment, brings to mind memories of the very unfortunate violence that resulted in the killing of the U.S. ambassador and other personnel in 2011 in Benghazi in Libya. And from there, we really start to spiral out of control. Beginning into the new year, Mike Pompeo, U.S. Secretary of State, cancels planned trips abroad. He's sort of coordinating the U.S. response to what's happening in the region. And then finally, we get to the 3rd of January, last Friday, when we learned that the United States has conducted a drone strike and killed Qasem Soleimani and another senior Iraqi militia leader. And Trump, of course, confirms that the next day. The Iranians confirm it. And that's really where we are. So Qasem Soleimani's sort of position in the Iranian hierarchy when it comes to foreign affairs, at least, President Hassan Rouhani has a ton of legitimacy and influence domestically. But in international affairs, really, Soleimani, after the supreme leader, was probably the second most influential person, right? So people have sort of analogized this as the equivalent of, let's say, the Iranians taking out, someone like Jim Mattis or General Petraeus when they were serving in the region, the leader of Central Command, the equivalent of that action. And several days later, there has been a lot of talk about potentially a spiral into conflict. The U.S. Strike has certainly been described as an act of war by many people, and certainly under international law, I think it could reasonably be read in that way. But every country of any influence that has stakes in the Middle East is paying very close attention to what is happening, and that, of course, goes for every major Asian power, and we've seen a variety of reactions from across the region. So, Prashant, I guess a place to maybe begin our discussion. We've been talking on the podcast when we were previewing 2020 and reflecting on 2019 on recent episodes. We were talking about how the Trump administration is likely to be more Trumpified, so to speak, in the sense that there are fewer guardrails on the president's instincts. You don't really have a character like Jim Mattis to place sort of red lines that the United States won't cross. Something like, Soleimani's killing is kind of difficult to imagine happening under Mattis. But now, of course, we have a very different administration, fewer people to second guess the president. And of course, we have heard the argument that this strike is really also being effectuated to distract from the president's woes after the impeachment vote in December. What do you make of that? Do you read this move by the United States in light of what's happening in Washington, D.C. and the changing nature of personnel within the administration?
Yeah, it's tough to say, right? Because, as we discussed on the one hand, you are seeing this trend where, a lot of the initial folks in the administration that people expected to either restrain Trump or at least put the administration in a more conventional position like McMaster or Mattis have left the administration. And so on the one hand, you would sort of think that this would lead to a more sort of, Trump-esque approach to Iran. But on the other hand, it is tough to sort of assess where this is exactly because, you laid out the timeline there very well in terms of the sequence of events. There are still things that we don't know about the decision making, the options that were laid out for Trump and how the selection process went. But also, Trump on Iran has really been, all over the map, sort of where he's been on several issues, sort of on the one hand saying, we might threaten to sort of ramp up the pressure on Iran, this approach of maximum pressure. But on the other hand, he's held out the potential for negotiations with Iran as well. And so it's very difficult to see where this, discrete event or development, takes the Trump administration's approach. We've seen, all kinds of interpretations. One interpretation is that, Trump was somehow trying to, reestablish deterrence that was seen to have been lost when the U.S. didn't react to several times when the Iranians were actually provoking the United States. But, it's very tricky to see what deterrence was being established against, right? We have very little sense of what, actual imminent attack that the administration is claiming was happening, was actually occurring. And then on the other hand, as well on the Iranian side, we really haven't seen a sort of clear response from them, with respect to the United States yet. The Iranians have several ways that they can react, across the spectrum. And so it is difficult to say what it means for Trump's foreign policy. I think one thing that we can say, though, is that, throughout the Trump administration, we've had this question. We've had issues of, the interagency process, Trump's very unconventional methods about foreign policy. And I think the big question on most observers' minds, including observers in Asia, is, okay, all this is maybe fine when you have a conventional administration, regular running of foreign affairs, but what happens when a crisis happens? And I think this is actually the closest that we've seen to a high-level crisis. We've had other crises, with North Korea, for example, but the Middle East often commands a lot of attention within U.S. foreign policy. And so this is the closest to which we've seen a test as to how the Trump administration is going to react and the dynamics of the administration. And I think so far, if you're seeing this as a test, I think there are several questions that remain about what this says about the administration's approach moving forward. And I think a lot of Asian countries are really scratching their heads and figuring out how do we react to this.
Yeah, well, so let's talk about some of those countries. I think the place to start here is probably China, right? So I've seen the argument being made on Twitter and elsewhere that China and Russia are gonna love this sort of rise in tensions in the Middle East because it distracts the United States from great power competition. Yet again, the United States is getting quagmired in the Middle East. We've seen confusion in just the last 24 hours about whether the United States is withdrawing from Iraq. It is not withdrawing. Apparently, that was all a terrible mistake from DOD. Mm-hmm. But I think that's a little bit of an oversimplification, right? If you look at what China and Russia have actually been saying and doing, and maybe it does make sense to take China and Russia together because I think we've actually seen a fair degree of coordination between Beijing and Moscow at the Security Council here in New York, certainly. But it's interesting because Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, Javad Zarif, was in China shortly before the Soleimani strike. And, China was pretty clear with its position, right? So the foreign minister, Wang Yi, said that China will stand against unilateralism and bullying. by the United States, which it didn't really name. But it did actually, remind the world that China continues to see the unilateral withdrawal by the United States from the JCPOA, quote, giving up on its international commitments and attempts to implement maximum pressure as being the source of tensions, right? So that's a pretty clear statement of where China places the blame. And the China-Iran relationship certainly remains vital for a number of reasons, right? So China has stakes, obviously, in the Middle East as the world's top energy importer. So energy stability, geopolitical stability, oil prices, all of that is critical for China as an importer. And obviously, I think the rise in tensions, whatever Beijing might get by having a United States that's more distracted and focused on Iran and the Iraq-Syria theater, which frankly, I mean, if you think about the first 3 years of the Trump administration, even as strategic documents have talked about great power competition, if you look at what the administration has been doing on a day-to-day basis, it's fairly easy to make a case that the United States has been just as involved in the Middle East, if not more, than in previous years. So that, to me, isn't really very convincing. But China certainly is watching everything that's been happening over the past few days quite closely. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the Chinese and the Russians, I think one of the ways in which we're seeing both of those countries come together is around this issue of the United States, which claims to be the guardian of the rules-based order, actually violating international law and previous commitments. And so the Iran issue has always been an area where they've looked to say, well, the United States has, reneged on a previous agreement. And there's also the issue of, a targeting of a key Iranian official and a domestic political debate in the United States as well about, what this says about international laws, as you briefly mentioned earlier. And then there's also this other issue, which is, as you pointed out, the Trump administration has made in official documents, great power competition as being the central preoccupation of U.S. foreign policy. But this obviously, the main sort of question here that the Iran question raises is, can the United States, do great power competition when it's focusing on these other contests that lay in the Middle East, which has dragged U.S. presidents in previously, particularly the Bush administration with the war in Iraq, but also the Obama administration had, its own set of problems about trying to remain free from Middle East entanglements while focusing on Asia. So I think that's another angle at which I think China would be looking at, right? So if you look at the Bush administration and Iraq, I think for the Chinese, in retrospect, it was a sort of window of opportunity for them to consolidate their gains in Asia. And so whether this will lead the United States to be pulled into the Middle East in several ways, as we see changes in the shape of the U.S. presence in Iraq, and broader engagements in the Middle East, what does that mean for the United States and Asia policy? That's the other big thing that you rightly flagged.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's gonna be interesting to see how this plays out. I mean, also another thing is that on Monday here in New York, the Chinese and Russian permanent representatives to the UN supposedly blocked a statement that the United States wanted to get put out at the Security Council, condemning the initial assault by the supporters of the militia on the U.S. embassy in Baghdad. And the Chinese and Russian position, which it's interesting if you read the statements by both ambassadors, they seem coordinated, was that, well, really, if we're going to put a statement out of the Security Council, we should probably include all of the events that have happened in the last few weeks, including the implication being, the strike on Soleimani. So that statement didn't happen. It'll be interesting to see if the Security Council can even come together on this issue. So certainly, I think China and Russia, I think, have learned their lesson. I mean, not recently; they've learned this lesson for a while now. After in 2011 abstaining on Resolution 1973, which authorized the Obama administration's action against Gaddafi's Libya, right? So China and Russia really are in no position right now, not least because of what's been happening over the past 3 years, certainly since the Trump administration has come into office, to really see the United States undertake any kind of adventurism against certainly Iran, but also even against Iraq. I mean, now we have talk of unilateral withdrawal, sanctions on Iraq. I mean, American policy against Iraq right now is totally confused. I shouldn't say against Iraq. I mean, Iraq's a U.S. ally right now, right? So it's really a mess. But I think China and Russia are really trying to position themselves to keep a lid on this, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're right to point to this, the UN and diplomatic angle too. I think, the initial instinct with the Soleimani killing is to sort of look at the military implications of this. but it is playing out diplomatically as well, right? So, and that affects Asian states. So, Vietnam is now, for example, one of the non-permanent members of the Security Council. The Vietnamese have taken over the presidency. And I recall last year when the Vietnamese were briefing folks about what their priorities were, there was an emphasis by Vietnamese officials in saying, okay, we have to be prepared for unprecedented developments and challenges and unexpected challenges that arise in 2020. Well, we've just seen the first evidence of this, right? So other countries in Asia and beyond will be caught in this diplomatic sort of engagement and rivalry and contestation between the United States, China, and Russia as well. So you're right to point to that as one avenue.
Yeah. One of the things I think, we should maybe talk about is North Korea. There's been a lot of talk about what North Korea is learning or not learning from this strike on Soleimani, right? I think the conventional take is that, well, this is going to show North Korea that they should never give up their nuclear weapons. I think that point is fine, although, North Korea is known for a long time that nuclear weapons have value, apart from, not getting your senior personnel killed. Mm-hmm. They have repeatedly made examples of what happened to Saddam Hussein and Gaddafi in their state media. It's simply a fact that they point to those examples. But even going further back, we could go back to 2013 when North Korean leader Kim Jong-un declared his so-called, Byungjin line, which was the sort of state policy line focusing on building up a powerful nuclear deterrent and an economy. But of course, he referenced, his grandfather, Kim Il-sung, and, he pointed to the Cuban Missile Crisis, looking at the United States as a source of tensions around the region. And of course, in the 1950s, you could even look at Eisenhower and Dulles and the first Taiwan Strait crisis, which not only taught Kim Il-sung something about the value of nuclear weapons, but even Mao, right? So that had a lot to do with China acquiring nuclear weapons. So I think the Soleimani killing, sure, it's another data point that shows that, a country like Iran that's currently got a very bad relationship with the United States is getting treated very differently than North Korea, which has a bad relationship with the United States, but also has nuclear weapons. And of course, Kim Jong-un got to go to Singapore and Hanoi, while Qasem Soleimani got to eat a precision-guided missile. Right, so that's a very different way to treat both of these countries. But I'm just not convinced that the North Korean reaction to this is going to be any different than what they've been doing. First of all, I've been of the view that the chances that they're going to voluntarily disarm are near zero. So I don't think you can really go much lower than that. So I don't think the Soleimani killing is measurably going to affect things. What is interesting, though, is, in 2003, when the United States began striking Iraq in March, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un's father, he disappeared for a matter of months, right? So the concern was, tensions between U.S. and North Korea were higher at the time. And that was just when the agreed framework, the 1994 agreement between the U.S. and North Korea, had fallen apart. So the North Koreans, I think, saw what was happening in Iraq, and there was a real concern that, North Korea might be next. But Kim Jong-un has just, if you look at North Korean state media today, he just carried out a public inspection. So it's not like he's in hiding in a bunker or anything like that. I don't know. That's sort of my view on the North Korea thing. What do you make of how the North Koreans might be viewing this?
No, I'd agree. I think it's very important, as much as, for the headlines, you can sort of talk about, twin nuclear crises, and, you have Iran, you have North Korea, and what are the differences? You do have to keep in mind that these are two separate cases. I do think, it is interesting in terms of the connection, how the headlines have developed in the last few weeks, right? You did see, before the new year, a focus on North Korea and sort of, could we see a crisis? What Kim Jong-un had said and what we might expect from North Korea coming into 2020. But I think the Soleimani killing has, put an emphasis on Iran as kind of the crisis in U.S. foreign policy for now. But I think the big worry is, if, despite the focus on, are we heading for World War III or some kind of conflict, if the Iranians are to take a more calibrated set of responses across a variety of realms, and they might sort of choose to at least be a bit more restrained, because, whatever it is, you look at the broad sort of longer term perspective for the Iranians, you do have a U.S. election coming up, later this year. And so whether they're trying to hedge against what Trump is doing and a potential, other U.S. president coming to office, there might be a tendency for the United States to perhaps think that, and other observers, right, to think that this is more of a Iran issue for the moment, but North Korea still remains a big challenge. And I would argue, North Korea already has nuclear weapons. It already has talked about what it is going to do. We have much clearer sense about what the North Koreans are planning. So we could have a situation where not only the United States and other countries are dealing with two nuclear crises, but the Iran situation, at least for now, seems to have at least stolen the headlines from North Korea. But I'm sure it'll be back, as we've discovered multiple times on the podcast before.
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, I can see the case in North Korea that, Napoleon Bonaparte's apocryphal statement that you should never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake sort of applies, right? The North Koreans can kind of bide their time and see what happens here. They've certainly been pretty quiet, with the exception of the party plenum at the end of the year, suggesting that they're no longer abiding by their missile and nuclear testing moratorium. So I expect we'll hear from them soon enough, but certainly I think the North Koreans aren't going to mind if the Middle East again soaks up a disproportionate amount of U.S. attention. I guess a final point to maybe think about is what about other sort of powers in Asia? I mean, particularly those aligned with the United States, including U.S. allies. Korea, Japan, India, Australia. All of these countries are obviously paying attention to what's happening in the Middle East for a variety of reasons. I mean, in the case of allies, if there is a major conflagration, they could be required or requested to contribute to a potential war effort, which I don't think any of them are particularly eager to or see it as being in their interest. But also, like China, Japan, India certainly are major energy importers and rely quite a bit on Iran specifically. Although the post JCPOA withdrawal sanctions have stemmed that a bit, have relied on energy stability also in the Gulf region. So what do you think is going on in many of these places?
I think it's sort of a mix of concern about strategically what we're seeing in the Middle East, as well as what the United States is going to do, but also kind of an urgent sense of trying to secure immediate interests of these countries. So I mean, Japan is a good example, which you brought up. So, we're already seeing, Prime Minister Abe is going to be now visiting several Middle Eastern countries, I think next week, Saudi Arabia, Oman, and UAE. And he has, positioned himself previously as being, not really a mediator, but at least someone who's trying to advocate for peace and stability when it comes to U.S.-Iran relations, trying to manage Japan's alignments there. And so it'll be interesting to see, what comes out of that. I think a lot of the other countries, you saw India, Jai Shankar spoke with several Middle Eastern countries, including Javad Zarif. And I think India is very cautious about trying to make sure this balance that it's tried to strike between securing its own interests, energy interests, and so on and so forth, but also making sure it doesn't get in the crosshairs of the Trump administration. I think the big issue for these U.S. allies, U.S. partners, is it may be in a context where U.S.-Iran relations are not in the headline news and top of U.S. foreign policy minds. It might be easier for them to kind of play this balancing act. But how do you play that balancing act where U.S.-Iran tensions are heightening, and it's of primary concern to U.S. policymakers? And I think that will be the key source of concern for these countries.
Yeah, well, I think we'll end this one here. Certainly, this is a fluid situation and far from being resolved. Although it does seem that after a few days, the Iranians don't appear to be eager to escalate for the moment, even though we've seen various kind of reports citing questionable, intelligence sources on Iran potentially readying its ballistic missile forces or whatever. But certainly, I think this isn't the last we're going to hear about U.S. attention being sort of diverted by ongoings in the Middle East. Of course, of the United States' own making. I mean, one of the takeaways here is, I think a lot of the political science literature sort of frowns on the notion of diversionary conflict, that leaders in democracies can initiate conflicts for electoral reasons or to divert from domestic concerns. I think there's a case to be made that the Trump administration might be a pretty good counterexample. Given what's happening in Washington. We've seen the administration do this, I think, before as well, making the most of national security matters to detract from the president's domestic woes. So we'll see what happens. I mean, a lot of this, like I said, remains very fluid. So I suspect we might be back on the podcast talking about future developments in the Middle East and their implications for Asia sooner rather than later, unfortunately, Prashant. But thanks a lot for joining me today.
Yeah, good to be with you.
Great. So for listeners, if you like what you heard on the podcast, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. You can do that on Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, or Spotify, or any other number of podcast providers. We're pretty ubiquitous there. And finally, if you've been a subscriber for a while but you haven't yet left us a review, please do that. We really do appreciate the reviews. They really help build our listenership for the podcast. And finally, just a note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics Podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia-Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back next week with more.